Welcome back to EpistemiX. It's been a while, and we're doing this one-off show with our brother today, Yusuf Pondering Soul. I don't know your surname, bro. Sorry, I apologize.
Ponders, just say Ponders.
Yusuf Ponders.
Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, bro. Wa alaikum salam. How you doing, bro?
Alhamdulillah, I'm doing good.
Alhamdulillah, bro. So it's really nice to have you here. Mashallah, you've come down from Manchester. We're going to spend the day together. We thought we'd do some filming. And alhamdulillah, brother Mohsin has kindly decided to film an epistemic show for us today, mashallah, after a long time. So, Jazakallah khair, Mohsin.
I just popped my head in.
Okay, alhamdulillah. All right, bro. So look, let's get to the topic. We've got about 15-20 minutes, inshallah.
Okay.
We're going to touch upon a very hot topic, right? Which is predestination,
Yes.
right? It's a question that comes up over and over again. It was one of the main, the initial points of discussion or disagreement amongst the early Muslims for many reasons. And unfortunately, what happens sometimes, especially in the times we live in today too, is that whenever I give dawah training courses, right? Whenever we're speaking to Muslims, non-Muslims, the question about predestination always comes up. On one end, you say God has determined everything. On one hand, you say that you have free will. This is a contradiction in your religion, right? Now, I want to get your thoughts on this, right? And I want to know how you address this. What do we need to understand? What are we talking about? Should we see it only from our perspective and therefore conclude it's a contradiction? Is there something else that's going on here? Is there something else that we need to appreciate as human beings? X, Y, and Z. So I'll let you take over and give us your thoughts, inshallah.
So I think, first of all, an important bit to mention, there was a discussion that Mohammed Hijab had with an ex-Muslim. I think it was in Canada or America when he went over there. And he made a great point. He said that even if you leave Islam or reject Islam because of this, you don't escape the problem. This is something the secular world still has to deal with. Atheists can't get rid of this conflict or this contradiction within their own systems. So the legal system in secular countries presupposes free will. The whole concept of justice relies on the fact that people are making choices and that they should be held accountable for those choices. And then you still have people like Sam Harris, for example, that say, no, free will is an illusion. Choice is not real. Everything is determined. And this results from the quote-unquote objective standpoint that science deals with. It assumes the world is one thing necessarily leads to the next, necessarily leads to that, so on and so forth. And from this perspective, whatever act happens was always going to happen, necessarily so. But these are not necessarily the case. It's not obvious that this is so. There is certain posturing on both sides. Some people say, no, everything is completely free will. Some people say that everything is determined. Some people are compatibilists, or they'll sit in the middle and endure the tension or the conflict between these two concepts. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the issue is with conflating of different spheres or perspectives. And one of these spheres are beyond our reach or beyond our ability to actually sit within. And so the issue here, if you're thinking from a theistic perspective, you say, we have free will. The human being is experiencing the world temporally. They go through the world one moment after the other.
So let's just clarify this definition just for the people watching. So you're saying, as human beings, we experience the world from one perspective. And I think what you're saying, I completely agree with you, bro, is the approach I take is always to firstly get people to appreciate that to understand this whole thing about predestination, you have to appreciate that you cannot understand this purely from one perspective or your sphere of understanding as a human being. So now we're talking about the spheres here, right? Which is, we have our sphere, which is, you said, linear and it's temporal.
And finite.
Finite. Okay, so when you say our sphere is temporal, what do you mean?
Well, temporal is just the experience of time.
Okay.
So we experience one moment, we have a future that we move towards, and we project ourselves into the future in the sense that we envisage possibilities. We see certain opportunities arise, and we can see that there's certain choices that we can make when these opportunities arise. All of this as well presupposes external causes.
Yes.
So the idea of free will isn't saying that there isn't external causes which are not affecting our choices. It's necessary for any conception of free will to even make sense. When you're making choices, that necessarily means that things are happening outside of you which are affecting you. And then from this, you're picking a path. You're making a choice in which direction you want to go. And then upon doing that, possibilities close down and things become, so a particular one of them possibilities ceases to be possible and becomes actual.
Okay. So what you're saying, just to again summarize, is that we are experiencing reality. For example, if there was a ruler to A and then to Z, and we are experiencing, so we're at A and we're moving towards Z.
Yeah,
so
A,
we
B, C, D,
we,
E,
we have to, we are bound by this.
Necessarily so.
And we have to traverse this ruler in this particular way. And in doing so, along the way, we are presented with choices, and we have to make the choices. And the choice, say there's 3 choices, we choose option 2, and then the other choices close in, and that option 2 manifests, and then we move through, and until in the near future we have to face other choices. So that's how reality works from our perspective, and we're bound by this necessarily so, like you said. So okay, so that's our perspective.
Okay, we
have to make those free choices. We had that free will from that perspective. Now, how do we now address this thing where from because we're limited to our perspective and our sphere, right? And this is the point you made as well, which is that we can only see, understand, perceive, comprehend things from our sphere,
through our own eyes,
from our own eyes and experiences and our limitations and our minds and our intellects and our faculties. So now, from that perspective, when we say God has predetermined everything, the jump we make is contradiction. Right.
So generally, what will be said is that something along the lines, well, has God determined that you make that choice? And the issue here for me is more a semantical one. Is you don't have to word it like that, and if you do, it implies something which isn't necessarily the case. But there's no obvious reason why we should be wording that observation in that way, and it's mainly the way you're wording it that kind of gives rise to that conclusion. You can also say, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has determined that an opportunity arises where you have the ability to make a choice. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be viewing you, and he'd have seen your past and your future and everything occur. And
so from Allah's sphere, that's what you say. So if we were to say that from the perspective of God, it's not like human perspective. It's not linear. Allah is not bound by time, etc. So we can't even begin to entertain that realm and how things unfold in that realm, right?
And we can talk about it to a certain degree, but we are forced to use metaphor. And so a good example here would be when we're talking about infrared. For example, if you've got a camera that's looking at heat, when you present that as an image, we are forced to use colours that we are familiar with, because that's what our eyes pick up, and that's how our brains understand it. And so the people who set these cameras up, these infrared things that pick up heat, they set programs to take in particular information, and then they translate that information into something that's palatable to human experience. So it's not that when you're looking at heat with this camera that the heat is actually red. It's not that cold is actually blue. It's
we're translating that reality which is beyond us in a way that we can perceive it and understand it.
It's a metaphor. And it allows us to engage with these ideas, but it's not telling us the truth about the experience of such a thing. So when you're looking at that, say for example, you get some people, they have issues where they can't feel heat or they can't feel cold. You know, they have a problem with their nervous system. They can look at something like, you know, the image given of an infrared camera, and they might be able to assume that they understand what it means to feel heat, and they go, oh no, I've seen this now. It's the same like, for example, if a deaf person, have you seen the images where there's a speaker with bass and they put sand or rice on top of it, and certain frequencies give rise to certain patterns? Someone who's deaf might look at that and say, I now understand what it means to hear. But there's the experience of a metaphor which helps you to maybe relate to it, but you're not by any means getting access to the complete picture. And it's the same issue here when we're talking about the perspective of God. We are finite beings. We have limits. And if we're talking about God, whether you believe in him or not, if for philosophical reasons you're just, for the sake of arguments, assuming God's existence, and you're assuming the fact that this is an infinite being, that is, he's the source of all power, he's
the creator of everything,
the creator of everything there is. If he is infinite, it's by necessity that you have to conclude, whether or not you believe in him, if you're assuming the existence of this being, that you cannot encapsulate him. You cannot comprehend what it would be like to be in this position.
Yeah.
And the reason is because we are stuck in our finite positions.
You gave another example of the colors. I thought that was very like a penny drop moment when you said you can't imagine a color that you've never experienced or seen, right?
So the issue here is like when someone's saying, well, let's imagine what it would be like to try to comprehend this free will issue from the perspective of God. Well, the first question is as well, is it absurd to assume that you can put yourself in that position? And you can come to that conclusion by saying, well, can you imagine a color you haven't experienced?
Yeah.
We've got a spectrum of colors that we have experienced.
Yeah.
I'm asking you now to imagine one beyond that, and that would be, for example, infrared or ultraviolet, which are on this light spectrum, and we don't experience them, but we know they exist.
Yeah.
And if I'm asking you to imagine what it would be like to actually be able to see that as a color, what would that color express itself as? You can't do that. Yeah. And the reason is because you lack the experience to be able to do so. Okay,
brilliant. So I think there's a few very powerful things you're saying here. So number one, you're saying is we need to appreciate our limitations when it comes to such the reality of God. Yeah. We can only really know about God what God has told us about himself, essentially, right? Because it's a realm that's beyond us. It's a sphere that's beyond us, right? And if we understand that and we appreciate that, then we realize that we're limited to our sphere.
Yep.
And from our sphere, we can only understand things from our perspective, which is limited to our sphere. Yep. And we can't cross over into the sphere of the divine, because that's it's impossible to do that. We can't do that.
There's really another good example here as well. In times of war, you rely on intel from behind the horizon or behind what would be referred to in war times as the enemy lines, from people who are there. Now, you being, say, in the UK during World War II fighting the Nazis, if you're in London's intelligence bases and you're trying to figure things out, you cannot say with any certainty what's going on behind the lines except from what is communicated to you.
Yes.
And then you would have to rely on reliable sources, i.e. agents that are trustworthy, that have gone beyond that point, to relay that information to you. And insofar as they're relaying that information to you and they're trustworthy, then you can say you have knowledge of what is beyond your horizon.
Yeah.
And that is made possible to extend yourself beyond the horizon from a messenger that
that's
is
coming
beyond that
from
point.
that point.
Yeah.
So again, by greater reason, what we're saying is now when you're talking about the realm of God, it's impossible for us to cross over and understand that the only information we can know about God is what God tells us. It comes from
whatever
that
He is transmitting to us, we can from that talk about what is beyond there, but then we're still limited to our understanding of particular concepts.
Because when God communicates with us, we're only going to be able to understand what's possible from the perspective of our sphere and our language, our intellectual capacities, etc. All of these things. So I think tying this together, what we're saying is, when it comes to something like predestination and free will, we're talking about two spheres, and the fact that we can't access both spheres, we're limited to our sphere, means that we will probably never be able to fully grasp and understand what's going on, how these two spheres are merging with each other and crossing over, and how that merging results in the reality that God has determined everything, He knows everything, but at the same time we have free will, and we from our sphere we have to make those choices. How this works, it's beyond us. And so, and another thing I think was powerful is what we're saying is, if the contradiction arises, if you only limit yourself to one sphere,
I wouldn't even call it a contradiction. I call it a tension.
Okay,
because contradiction is implying there is an issue.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily the case. And so, for example, a really good example of this is also with what's called the triple point. Now, people back in the day, they understood freezing point as one thing and boiling point as another. And that you put them as opposites and you see them like here and there. Now, the triple point is where pressure has been reduced to such a point where boiling point and freezing point is the same. And so if you have water in a depressurized area, you will see it boiling and freezing simultaneously. And this might make people go, oh, well, that's a contradiction. If you've come from the understanding that boiling is there, freezing is there, these are completely opposite things, and that they could never occur at the same time. Now, there's a higher principle at play here that hasn't been taken into consideration because of lack of knowledge. Now, we can now understand with knowledge that the reason of this is the higher principle is pressure levels. And the higher the pressure is, the further these points are, the lower the pressure is, the closer they come together. And the boiling point and freezing point being together at the same time would be that tension.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're dealing with the idea of free will, determinism, and things
Yeah.
like that, I would say that there's a higher principle that we're not necessarily taking into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And when these things come close and it seems as if one is destroying the other,
Mm-hmm.
the reason is just simply that we're extending ourselves beyond our abilities, beyond
Yes.
our horizon.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's not necessarily the case. Because if you're an atheist and you want to look at this and you want to say, oh no, this is a contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have these things. It's not been shown sufficiently
Yeah.
in philosophical
You're making
argument.
that conclusion based on your sphere, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
And
well,
your limited
you're
knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, in order to make the conclusion that it's necessarily so, that these two principles contradict,
Yeah.
you have to presuppose you have the ability to take the position of God,
Yes.
which you'd have to be extremely
Yeah.
arrogant to
And
say that you can't, whether or not
Yeah.
you believe in God.
Yes.
And I don't mean that in
Yeah.
a way to offend anybody.
Yeah, and I think it takes us to the point of humility that I want to wrap up on. I think is very important because we've come on a bit of a journey here now. So and it's very interesting because I think it was the lack of humility on the part of the human being which resulted in one or two things, which was number one, people ended up in history, even in Islamic history, coming to the conclusion that, oh, God has determined everything, therefore there is no free will, therefore everything is determined, therefore do whatever you want, there's no accountability, etc., etc. And there was some groups that actually fell into this, and there was others who said, well, we have free will, therefore nothing is determined.
And
Right?
they denied attributes.
Exactly. So it was, again, it was that, I think it was that the human arrogance at play here, which with the underlying assumption that the human being has the ability to understand everything. So our intellect is the cap, and from that perspective we can judge and make conclusions about certain things, but that's not the truth. What we're saying here, what you're highlighting, is that the most rational thing to do is to understand the limits of your rationality.
And this is different
your
from
sphere.
denial of reason altogether.
Yes.
So some people might derive from what we've said so far that we're anti-rationalists.
Yeah.
That we're saying, oh no, everything is irrational, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
No. What I'm saying is that using reason,
Yes.
you can figure out your limits.
Yes.
You can figure out at what point things become possibilities.
Yes.
And beyond our ability to know with absolute certainty. The only argument I would say we can know for sure is that it doesn't necessarily follow from the fact that we have this concept of free will and we have this concept of predetermination. It doesn't follow from these two concepts that there is a contradiction, because in order to make that conclusion necessary,
You have to jump the spheres.
Yeah, you have to
know
be able
both
to go
spheres.
from your finite position to an infinite one,
Yeah.
which I'm saying is not possible.
It's impossible.
And insofar as it's not possible to jump from the finite sphere to the infinite, then you cannot conclude necessarily that they contradict.
Okay, so bro,
only that there's tension.
Brilliant. So based on that now, based on that understanding that we've come to, that we are limited, we can't take ourselves to this infinite sphere, we can't put ourselves in the mind of God. That's the realm of God. We're in the realm of human beings in our limited sphere. So understanding this, bro, there's two real choices now, right? There's the position of humility, right? And realizing this is the limit of my intellect, and I'm going to be humble, and I'm going to do what I can within my sphere, and what God has told me to do in Revelation, which is what? Which is to know God and to worship Him. To do the best you can on this planet, on this earth, in this life, so that you can attain paradise and you can attain the pleasure of God. Focus on that. That's the most rational thing to do. No different from, for example, when an atheist or anyone is on a plane and the pilot says, fasten your seatbelts, there's turbulence. You obey authority. You submit to the authority, because your intellect at that point is telling you the pilot is the authority, and the most rational thing to do is obey him, because that's the limit of my knowledge at that point.
And it would also
right?
not be reasonable for this person to say, no, I'm not putting my seatbelt on, not until
That
you've
would be
explained every
crazy.
principle.
That would be the most
me.
irrational thing to do. You
Yeah.
think the person's insane, right?
Know your limits, know
Yeah.
your bounds,
Yeah.
stay in your lane.
Or when you go to the doctor and you're sick and the doctor prescribes you medication and you're saying, nah, I don't want this. I
Give me
want
the
this
papers.
instead. Yeah,
I
give me
want-
the
yeah,
papers.
I
I
want
want
the
this
essay.
instead. I want to take this dose. That would be ridiculous, right? So what we're saying is, know the limits. And once you understand the limits like you've articulated, then from that perspective to submit to what God has said, especially when it comes to the realm of God and who God is. So from our perspective, what we need to appreciate is that we do have free will, and we need to therefore conduct ourselves in a responsible way where we make the right choices and therefore attain God's pleasure and His paradise, right? And therefore in doing so, we're fulfilling the purpose of our existence, which is to worship God, right? Anything else you want to say to wrap up?
There was a thing.
It was still something.
And I'm trying to remember
It
what
was
it was.
something.
Well, for me, I think the most important thing to remember is to begin with sincerity. When you're approaching these things, they can become very esoteric very quickly, very complex. You can get lost in a maze of information and of paths. And it's never really clear for people who are just starting to engage in these kind of complex ideas, these complex issues, which one is right. And a lot of the time it's just limits in terms of how much information we have, personal reasons in terms of your ability to comprehend complex issues. And I think that the most important thing is just to have a sincerity in your heart, to know your limits, like we've been explaining, and to sincerely want to seek truth, whatever that may be, and to sincerely seek to be a good person. And it's an internal thing, and it's this submission to your own finite position.
Absolutely. And a part of submission to God is to recognize your own limits, and therefore to submit to Him.
I know this applies to atheists as well. Like even if you're someone who doesn't believe in God, you know, whether it's actively denying His existence or simply being agnostic about it, you know, if you start with that position of just, I am sincerely seeking truth, I am sincerely wanting to be a good person, whatever that is, then that's a good starting point, I think. And
brilliant.
Just so long as you're not jumping to these wild conclusions that you can say for certain that these are a contradiction, and then denying the possibility that Islam is true as a result of these arguments, then just avoid doing that, because like I say, philosophically it's not necessarily so. That
and also a sincerity and humility dictates that the human being would focus on what God is asking you for humans to focus on, right? And therefore the fact that we may be engaging or wanting to engage in the realm of discussing predetermination and be fixated on these things so much so that we're not focusing on the core highlights that there's something else going on inside as well, or may do. So I guess I think we've given enough regarding this topic,
Inshallah.
Which is to be humble, to realize the limits of your intellect, and to focus on what's really important, and not to delve into areas which are just going to take you off track, basically. Right?
Stay within your lane.
Stay within your lane.
Don't jump in the deep end of a swimming pool if you can't swim.
Jazakallah khair, bro. May Allah bless you.
And you
so,
too,
guys, if you watch this, you know Yusuf, he has a channel, Pondering Soul, on YouTube. Make sure to subscribe. He has other brilliant content on his channel too. Make sure to subscribe to this channel too. Click the like button. Leave your comments and thoughts below. We'll definitely check them out and see if there's any questions
Inshallah.
that we'll engage with further. Until next time, take care.
Assalamu alaikum.